March 15, 2019. Contractors renovating the Pemberton Mansion on Boston's Beacon Hill make an unexpected discovery. Behind the library's mahogany paneling lies a false compartment, untouched for over a century. Inside, dozens of letters tied with faded ribbon wait in perfect preservation. The paper feels fragile, almost sacred, as modern hands carefully extract correspondence that someone desperately wanted hidden. Each envelope bears only initials, AM to CR, CR to AM. Why would anyone construct such an elaborate hiding place for simple letters? The handwriting is exquisite, flowing in the practiced loops of expensive education. But something feels urgent beneath the elegant penmanship. Words pressed deep into expensive stationery, as if emotion itself guided the pen. My dearest companion, one letter begins. I count the hours until we might walk again in our private garden. Another speaks of stolen moments and careful glances across crowded parlors. These aren't business correspondence or family updates. The language carries weight, intimacy, longing. What secrets did AM and CR share in their careful script? To understand these hidden letters, we must enter the world that demanded their concealment. The 1880s Northeast pulsed with industrial wealth and rigid social codes. Boston's Beacon Hill represented the pinnacle of American aristocracy, where families traced their bloodlines to the Mayflower and measured their worth in railroad stocks and textile mills. Here, reputation wasn't just important, it was everything. A single scandal could topple dynasties built over generations. Every gesture, every association, every whispered conversation faced the scrutiny of society's unforgiving eye. But what happened when private desires refused to conform? The letters speak obsessively of botanical specimens. The purple orchids are thriving in our greenhouse, writes AM. I long to show you the rare varieties I've cultivated in secret. CR responds with equal enthusiasm about specimen collection and private botanical expeditions. To any casual observer, this appears to be harmless correspondence between amateur naturalists. Victorian society celebrated such refined hobbies among the educated classes. But why hide innocent gardening letters behind false walls? Something about these botanical references doesn't align with their desperate concealment. What did purple orchids really mean to these mysterious correspondents? Victorian culture spoke in symbols. The language of flowers allowed coded communication across drawing rooms and garden parties. A yellow rose meant friendship, red conveyed passion, white suggested purity. But some flowers carried messages too dangerous for public interpretation. Purple orchids, rare and exotic, symbolized deep admiration and something more. In botanical texts of the era, orchids represented love that dared not speak its name. Suddenly, these innocent gardening letters reveal their true nature. AM and CR weren't discussing horticulture. They were declaring forbidden feelings in the only language society might ignore. By the 1880s, American society had codified its moral boundaries with ruthless precision. The Comstock laws criminalized not just certain acts, but even discussing them. Newspaper editorials railed against unnatural affections and moral degeneracy. Ministers preached sermons about the corruption threatening Christian households. Police raided establishments suspected of harboring inappropriate associations. For the wealthy, these dangers multiplied exponentially. While working-class scandals might merit a paragraph in penny papers, elite transgressions became front-page spectacles that destroyed reputations across generations. In this climate, how did AM and CR dare to put their feelings into written words? Every aspect of these letters demonstrates sophisticated deception, The paper bears no letterhead, no embossed family crests, no identifying marks that might trace back to their authors. Even the ink appears deliberately common, lacking the distinctive qualities of expensive brands favored by Boston's elite. The envelopes show evidence of careful sealing techniques designed to reveal tampering. Most intriguingly, many letters contain instructions for destruction. Please burn this after reading. And let no trace remain of our correspondence. Yet here they survive, carefully preserved, despite explicit requests for elimination. Why did someone choose preservation over the safety that destruction would have provided? The letters reference specific locations throughout Boston and its surroundings. "Meet me at the usual bench in the Common," writes CR. "Our private corner of the Arnold Arboretum awaits," responds AM. These weren't random meeting places, but carefully chosen spots that offered privacy from prying eyes. The Boston Common provided anonymity among crowds of strangers. The Arnold Arboretum, newly established in 1872, offered secluded paths through botanical collections. Each location suggests intimate knowledge of the city's hidden geography. But who were these people? And how did they discover such perfect hideaways in America's most scrutinized social landscape? The correspondence spans nearly 3 years, from spring 1882 through winter 1884. Early letters overflow with discovery and wonder. "I never imagined such connection possible," writes AM. "You have awakened feelings I thought belonged only in poetry. But as months pass, anxiety creeps into their words." References to watching eyes and careful timing become frequent. By 1884, paranoia dominates their exchanges. "I fear we are no longer safe in our usual places," warns CR. "Perhaps we should cease our correspondence entirely." Yet the letters continue, suggesting a bond too powerful to sever despite mounting dangers. The letters' hiding place offers crucial clues about their authors' identity. The Pemberton mansion belonged to one of Boston's most prominent families, whose fortune derived from textile mills and China trade investments. Augustus Pemberton served on Harvard's Board of Overseers and maintained membership in the Somerset Club. His wife, Margaret, organized charity events for the Episcopal Church. Their social circle included senators, judges, and industrial barons who shaped America's Gilded Age policies. But family records show they had no children whose initials match AM or CR. Who else had access to this house and reason to hide letters within its walls? Victorian mansions operated through invisible networks of domestic staff who witnessed everything while remaining officially unseen. The Pemberton household employed 12 full-time servants, from the head butler down to scullery maids. These individuals possessed intimate knowledge of their employers' private lives, yet remained bound by economic necessity to maintain absolute discretion. Servant quarters occupied the mansion's upper floors and basement levels, spaces that offered both isolation and strategic hiding places. Could these letters belong to household staff members who found love within the rigid hierarchy of domestic service? Or do they represent something even more scandalous? Despite containing dozens of letters, this collection feels deliberately incomplete. References appear to photographs that aren't present, gifts that aren't described in detail, and meetings whose outcomes remain unclear. Several letters mention our mutual friend, who apparently facilitated their relationship, yet this person's identity remains hidden behind the same careful anonymity. Most puzzling are references to the others who share our circumstances, suggesting a broader network of individuals navigating similar challenges. Were AM and CR part of an underground community that found ways to exist within hostile social conditions? What happened to the missing evidence of their world? Beyond botanical metaphors, The letters employ sophisticated linguistic codes that reveal remarkable education and cultural knowledge. Classical references to Achilles and his beloved companion and David's lament for Jonathan provide historical precedents for their own relationship. Literary allusions to Walt Whitman's poetry appear frequently, particularly references to adhesive love and comrades. These weren't random cultural touchstones, but carefully chosen symbols that conveyed meaning to initiated readers while appearing harmless to casual observers. The depth of these references suggests correspondence with access to advanced education and extensive libraries. Who possessed such cultural sophistication in 1880s Boston? The letters reveal how cities offered unprecedented opportunities for anonymity and connection. Unlike rural communities where everyone knew their neighbors' business, Boston's growing population created spaces where individuals could disappear into crowds. AM and CR exploited this urban anonymity, meeting in public places where they appeared to be chance encounters between casual acquaintances. They describe elaborate systems for communication through intermediaries and coded messages left at predetermined locations. Their correspondence maps an invisible city within the visible one, a geography of secret meeting places and safe havens that existed parallel to official Boston society. The correspondence's final entries carry an ominous tone that suggests their discovery was imminent. Certain parties have begun making inquiries, writes CR in November 1884. We must be more careful than ever before. AM's response reveals mounting panic. Perhaps we should destroy everything and hope our memories prove sufficient. The last dated letter, December 15, 1884, contains only a few lines. They know. We must never meet again. Forgive me. After nearly 3 years of regular correspondence, the letters simply stop. No explanations, no gradual decline, just sudden, complete silence. What discovery forced this abrupt end to their relationship? Despite explicit instructions for destruction, someone preserved these letters with extraordinary care. The hidden compartment wasn't hastily constructed, but carefully designed by skilled craftsmen who understood the importance of protecting their contents from moisture, light, and discovery. This preservation required significant financial resources and access to the mansion during its construction or renovation. The contradiction between the letters, calls for destruction, and their meticulous preservation suggests a third party who understood their historical significance. Was someone else involved in AM and CR's relationship? Someone who chose to honor their memory by defying their final wishes? Historical research into the Pemberton family reveals intriguing gaps in their documented social life. Family photographs from the 1880s show empty spaces at formal gatherings, suggesting cropped figures whose presence became inconvenient to remember. Guest lists for social events contain crossed-out names and mysterious initials that don't correspond to known family friends. Most tellingly, the family's detailed household accounts show regular payments to individuals identified only by first names or initials, payments that ceased abruptly in early 1885. These archival shadows suggest deliberate erasure of certain relationships. What evidence was systematically removed from the historical record? Boston Society papers from 1884 and 1885 contain subtle references to unnamed scandals among prominent families. Recent discoveries have necessitated certain social adjustments, notes one gossip column cryptically. Another mentions inappropriate associations that required immediate correction. The Somerset Club's membership records show several resignations during this period, listed without explanation. Even more telling, Several wealthy Boston families sent adult children on extended European tours during the winter of 1884 to 85, a common method for allowing scandals to fade from public memory. Were AM&CR part of a broader crisis that shook Boston's elite social structure? As we hold these fragile letters, we confront the profound loneliness of lives lived in shadow. AM&CR possessed education, cultural sophistication, and apparent financial resources, yet they remained prisoners of social expectations that demanded the denial of their deepest feelings. Their careful codes and elaborate precautions speak to both the intensity of their connection and the terror that discovery would bring. They created beauty in their hidden world, passionate letters, secret meetings, coded gifts, while knowing that exposure would destroy not just their relationship, but their entire social existence. Their story ends in silence, but their letters refuse to stay buried. The correspondence begins innocently enough. "My dear friend," writes AM in careful copperplate, "I've discovered the most extraordinary botanical specimens in the conservatory gardens. But look closer at these letters, preserved between the pages of a leather journal. Why would a shipping heir spend pages describing the delicate petals of purple orchids? Why mention secret gardens that bloom only at midnight? These weren't the casual observations of a gentleman botanist. They were something far more dangerous in 1880s Boston society. What did these botanical codes really mean to those who wrote them? Victorian gentlemen created an entire language of flowers to express what society forbade them to speak aloud. Purple orchids meant forbidden desire. White lilies signified pure devotion. Yellow roses warned of danger approaching. Each pressed flower in AM's journal tells a story that proper Boston would never acknowledge. These weren't gardening notes. They were love letters, disguised as horticultural observations, carrying messages that could destroy reputations and end careers if discovered by the wrong eyes. Alexander Morrison posed for his formal portrait in the spring of 1882, age 27, heir to the Morrison shipping fortune. Study his face carefully. The photographer captured something the family never intended to preserve. His eyes don't meet the camera directly. They gaze just left, toward someone standing outside the frame. Notice the violet boutonniere on his black tailcoat, a detail his mother surely thought was merely fashionable. But violets carried their own message in the flower language: faithfulness and love, no matter the obstacles. Who was he signaling? Alexander's personal effects reveal the weight of family expectation. His mahogany desk bore the Morrison crest, 3 ships crossing turbulent waves, with the motto, "Honor through commerce." His father expected him to marry well, produce heirs, expand the family's maritime empire. The silver letter opener, engraved with his initials, had opened hundreds of business correspondences. But hidden in the desk's false bottom were different letters entirely. These spoke not of shipping routes and profit margins, but of stolen glances across crowded rooms, and the agony of loving someone society deemed impossible to love. The Somerset Club's monthly poetry readings provided perfect cover for conversations that couldn't happen elsewhere. Every third Thursday, Boston's most cultured gentlemen gathered in the club's oak-paneled library to discuss Tennyson, Browning, and the Romantic poets. Officially, they debated meter and metaphor over brandy and cigars. Unofficially, they found ways to speak truths that drawing rooms and business offices would never tolerate. Poetry gave them permission to discuss love, longing, and beauty without raising suspicions. After all, what could be more respectable than literature? In this sanctified space of literature and learning, hands could brush briefly while reaching for the same volume of Whitman. A gloved finger might trace a particularly moving passage, drawing attention to lines about comradeship and devotion. Alexander found himself anticipating these evenings with an intensity that surprised him. The formal ritual of scholarly discussion became charged with possibility. One evening in October 1882, as autumn rain drummed against the club's tall windows, a new member joined their circle. He signed the attendance book simply as C.R. But who was this mysterious figure? Charles Rutherford entered Boston society like a carefully composed sonnet, every word chosen, every gesture measured. He claimed to represent European art dealers, seeking American collectors for paintings and sculptures. His letters of introduction were impeccable, his manners refined, his knowledge of literature impressive. But something about C.R. didn't quite align with his stated biography. His hands were too soft for someone who supposedly handled artwork. His accent occasionally slipped from cultured Boston to something more working class. Alexander noticed these discrepancies, yet found himself drawn deeper into the mystery rather than away from it. Charles claimed expertise in the pre-Raphaelite painters, those controversial artists who challenged Victorian moral strictures through their sensual depictions of beauty and desire. He spoke eloquently of Rossetti's passionate lovers, of Burne-Jones's ethereal knights, of paintings that dared suggest love might transcend society's narrow definitions. When he described these works to the poetry circle, his voice carried a subtle intensity that made conventional gentlemen shift uncomfortably in their chairs. But Alexander leaned forward, captivated. Here was someone who understood that art could express what life forbade you to live openly. Their eyes met during a discussion of Whitman's Leaves of Grass, that scandalous collection that proper Bostonians read in private, but rarely acknowledged publicly. Charles was reading aloud. For the one I love most lay sleeping by me under the same cover in the cool night. The words hung in the tobacco-scented air like a confession. Alexander felt heat rise to his cheeks, certain that everyone in the room could see his reaction. But when he dared to look up, only Charles was watching him, and in that gaze was unmistakable understanding. They recognized something in each other. The evening's formal program ended at 10:30, but Alexander lingered, pretending to examine the club's rare book collection. He waited until the other members departed, their conversations fading into the October night. Charles approached the bookshelf where Alexander stood, ostensibly interested in the same leather-bound volumes. "Remarkable evening," Charles said quietly, his voice carrying layers of meaning. "Indeed," Alexander replied, his heart racing. Standing so close, he could smell Charles's cologne, something European, expensive, and entirely different from the predictable fragrances worn by proper Boston gentlemen. The moment stretched between them, loaded with possibility and danger. 3 days later, a letter arrived at Alexander's Beacon Hill mansion. The envelope bore no return address, but inside, elegant handwriting discussed rare orchid specimens recently discovered in a private conservatory. "The purple varieties show particular promise," Charles had written, "though they require careful cultivation away from public gardens." Alexander read the letter 3 times before understanding its true message. Charles was extending an invitation, not to view flowers, but to explore the dangerous territory they had glimpsed in each other's eyes. The botanical code had found its second participant. Alexander spent the entire next morning composing his reply. How do you accept an invitation to forbidden love while maintaining the pretense of discussing horticulture? Your observations on purple orchids intrigue me greatly, he finally wrote. I would be most interested in viewing your private conservatory, perhaps when the blooms are at their most vibrant. Surely such rare specimens deserve appreciation by those who truly understand their value. Every word carried double meaning. Every sentence walked the knife's edge between plausible innocence and unmistakable invitation. He sealed the letter with trembling hands, knowing it could change everything. Charles's reply arrived within hours, an impossibly fast response that suggested he had been waiting, hoping. The conservatory, he wrote, was located in a private estate outside the city. Accessible by a discreet carriage route, the specimens are best viewed in the evening hours, when their true colors emerge. Alexander understood. They would meet away from Boston's watching eyes, in a place where Victorian society's rigid rules held no power. The appointment was set for the following Thursday at dusk. As Alexander burned Charles's letter in his fireplace, he wondered if he was destroying evidence or burning his bridges to respectability forever. Thursday arrived gray and cold, with November wind rattling the windows of Alexander's mansion. He dressed carefully, choosing his most understated clothing, nothing that would draw attention or suggest a social engagement. No boutonniere, no family jewelry, no distinctive accessories that might be remembered if spotted. He told his household staff he was attending a business meeting and would return late. The lie came surprisingly easily. As he prepared to leave his comfortable, predictable world behind, Alexander caught his reflection in the hallway mirror. The man looking back was someone he barely recognized, someone capable of choosing desire over duty. The hired carriage took him through Boston's familiar streets, then out into the Massachusetts countryside, where gas lamps gave way to darkness, and the sound of hoofbeats on cobblestones became hoofbeats on dirt roads. Alexander had never felt more aware of crossing a boundary, not just geographical, but moral and social. With each mile from Beacon Hill, he moved further from the world that had shaped him since birth. The carriage lanterns cast dancing shadows on the November landscape, and in those shifting patterns of light and dark, Alexander saw a metaphor for his own life. Illuminated moments surrounded by vast territories of concealment. The carriage stopped before wrought iron gates that opened onto a tree-lined drive. No nameplate identified the property, just ornate metalwork twisted into patterns of vines and flowers. As they approached the main house, Alexander saw it was smaller than he'd expected, more cottage than mansion, with warm light glowing in diamond-paned windows. This wasn't a grand estate where wealthy collectors displayed their art. This was a private retreat, chosen for its isolation rather than its grandeur. Charles had selected a place where they could speak freely, away from servants who might gossip and neighbors who might observe. The intimacy of the setting made Alexander's pulse quicken, with both excitement and alarm. Charles opened the door before Alexander could knock. He had been watching for the carriage's arrival. "Welcome to my conservatory," he said with a slight smile, though no glass houses were visible anywhere. The cottage's interior surprised Alexander with its refined simplicity. Persian rugs covered polished wood floors, and paintings lined the walls. Not the pre-Raphaelite works Charles claimed to represent, but intimate portraits and landscapes that spoke of personal taste rather than commercial investment. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, and 2 glasses of wine waited on a small table. Charles had prepared for this evening with the same careful attention Alexander had given to his coded letters. For the first time in months, they spoke directly. No botanical metaphors, no literary allusions, no careful double meanings. Charles explained that he wasn't really an art dealer. He was a clerk at a downtown bank who had grown tired of pretending to be someone he wasn't. The European credentials were fabricated, the cultured accent practiced, the sophisticated background entirely invented. He had created this persona to gain access to circles where he might find others like himself, men who understood the loneliness of living a lie. Alexander listened without judgment. After all, Wasn't he doing the same thing, pretending to be the dutiful son while concealing his true nature? As the evening deepened, Charles led Alexander through French doors onto a small terrace behind the cottage. Here was the real garden, not a metaphor, but an actual space where someone had planted flowers that bloomed in defiance of November's cold. Hardy chrysanthemums and late roses created splashes of color in the darkness. "I wanted one place where beautiful things could grow openly," Charles explained. They stood close together in the chill air, their breath visible in small clouds. Alexander reached out tentatively, his gloved fingers brushing Charles's hand. Neither man pulled away. The secret garden had become real, and they were standing in it. What if the most dangerous liaisons bloomed in plain sight? The Somerset Club's mahogany doors opened every third Thursday to Boston's cultural elite. Gas lamps flickered against leather-bound volumes as gentlemen gathered for poetry readings, their voices reciting Tennyson and Whitman. But was literature truly their only passion? Among the brandy snifters and cigar smoke, certain glances lingered too long. Certain conversations carried undertones that had nothing to do with verse. The perfect camouflage, wrapped in respectability. Watch the evidence closely. A gloved hand reaches for a volume of poetry, fingers brushing against another's wrist. An accident? The recipient doesn't pull away. Instead, he leans closer, ostensibly to examine the binding. Their shoulders almost touch as one whispers about metaphors and hidden meanings. The other nods, his breath quickening. Literature becomes pretext. Poetry becomes code. And somewhere between Shelley and Shakespeare, hearts begin to race with possibilities that Victorian society would never acknowledge. Alexander Thornton found himself attending every reading, claiming scholarly interest. But scholars don't memorize the seating preferences of fellow enthusiasts. They don't time their arrivals to coincide with specific attendees. Night after night, he positioned himself across from the young lawyer with penetrating dark eyes, the one who quoted Byron with unsettling intensity. When their gazes met during a particularly passionate recitation, the air itself seemed to thicken. This was no longer about literature. This was about hunger, carefully disguised as intellectual pursuit. But who was this magnetic stranger? The man signed his name in the club's guest registry with flourishing strokes, CR. Those initials appeared in Alexander's diary with increasing frequency, surrounded by careful observations about literary technique and poetic interpretation. Yet between the lines, something far more personal was taking root. CRS laughed during Wilde's epigrams. CRS thoughtful silence after Whitman's more provocative verses. CRS habit of adjusting his cufflinks when nervous. These weren't scholarly notes. They were the detailed studies of infatuation, meticulously disguised. Charles Rothwell had clawed his way into Boston society through Harvard Law and relentless ambition. His father made fortunes in railroad speculation, while old Boston families whispered about his origins. Every invitation was earned, not inherited. Every conversation carried the weight of proving himself worthy. Yet here, among leather-bound classics and inherited privilege, he found himself drawn to the one man whose acceptance mattered most. Alexander Thornton represented everything Charles yearned to become, if only their connection could remain safely hidden behind discussions of meter and rhyme. What made Charles dangerous wasn't just his intelligence, it was his transparency. While Alexander had mastered the art of aristocratic reserve, Charles's emotions flickered across his features like candle flames. When he argued legal precedent, passion transformed his entire bearing. When he quoted Keats, His voice carried genuine longing. Alexander found himself studying those unguarded moments, memorizing the way Charles's hands moved when he spoke, the way his eyes darkened during particularly intense discussions. Here was someone who felt deeply, despite the risks such feeling entailed. But Charles's ambitions made any scandal doubly treacherous. His law practice depended on Boston's elite accepting him as one of their own. His family's reputation hung by threads of carefully cultivated respectability. One whispered accusation could destroy everything they'd built. Yet when Alexander approached him after a particularly stirring reading of Tennyson's In Memoriam, Charles didn't step away. Instead, he lingered, discussing the poem's themes of love and loss with an intensity that had nothing to do with literary criticism and everything to do with possibility. Their first private conversation lasted 3 hours. What began as commentary on Whitman's controversial verses evolved into something far more personal. Charles spoke of feeling like an outsider. Despite his professional success, Alexander confided his suffocation within society's expectations. They discovered shared loneliness beneath their public facades. Two intelligent men trapped in roles that demanded everything while offering nothing genuine in return. When the club's porter finally announced closing time, neither man wanted to leave. The connection between them had shifted from attraction to understanding. How does forbidden love find expression? Through metaphor, through symbol, through the careful language of things left unsaid. Alexander began their correspondence cautiously, discussing botanical specimens in his conservatory. Charles replied with equal care, noting how certain rare plants required specific conditions to flourish. But their letters grew bolder with each exchange. "The orchid you admired has begun to bloom," Alexander wrote. "Its beauty exceeds all expectation, though few are privileged to witness its splendor." Even the Postal Service became complicit in their carefully coded courtship. Charles's responses revealed a man desperate for genuine connection. "Your conservatory sounds extraordinary," he replied. "I confess to spending considerable time imagining its layout, wondering if such delicate specimens might thrive under careful, devoted attention." The subtext was unmistakable and thrilling. Two educated men, masters of language, using every literary device at their disposal to express feelings that society deemed unspeakable. Each letter pushed boundaries further, testing how much truth could hide behind botanical metaphors and horticultural observations. Alexander's next letter abandoned all pretense of casual interest. "The rare orchid you mentioned has taken root in my conservatory," he wrote, his handwriting growing more urgent with each word. "I find myself tending it with unusual devotion, checking its progress morning and evening. Such specimens require constant attention, yet reward their caretakers with beauty beyond description. I wonder, might you visit to observe its development firsthand?" The invitation was unmistakable, the risk enormous, the desire undeniable. But observe that gold band on Alexander's writing hand, evidence of a complication that threatened everything. He was engaged to Margaret Whitmore, daughter of a shipping magnate. Their union arranged to merge two fortunes and secure both families' social positions. The wedding was planned for spring. Invitations had been ordered. Margaret's trousseau was being assembled by Boston's finest seamstresses. Yet here he sat, writing love letters to another man, his wedding ring catching candlelight like a golden shackle binding him to a future he no longer wanted. Each letter became an act of rebellion against the life mapped out for him. Alexander wrote with increasing desperation, pouring emotions onto paper that he could never speak aloud. "I dream of conversations unguarded by convention," he confessed to Charles. of moments when pretense falls away like autumn leaves. His handwriting grew more hurried, more urgent, as if speed might overcome the magnitude of what he was risking. The candle burned lower, the night grew deeper, and still he wrote, caught between duty and desire. Charles's reply arrived within days, his usual caution abandoned. Your conservatory has captured my imagination entirely. I find myself distracted during court proceedings, thinking of rare blooms that flourish only under specific conditions. Perhaps some specimens are worth any risk to their caretakers. He signed it simply, Your devoted botanist, C.R. The formality was gone. The pretense, stripped away. Two men stood at the precipice of something that could destroy them both, and neither could pull back from the edge. But what of Margaret Whitmore? She waited in her family's Beacon Hill mansion, planning seating arrangements and selecting china patterns for a future that felt increasingly like a beautiful prison. Alexander attended required social calls, made appropriate conversation about wedding preparations, and smiled at jokes about married life. Yet his thoughts remained elsewhere, dwelling on dark eyes and passionate discussions of poetry. Margaret noticed his distraction but attributed it to pre-wedding nerves. How could she imagine that her fiancé's heart was already promised to someone else entirely? The machinery of their engagement ground forward with inexorable momentum. Caterers were consulted. The church was reserved. Wedding announcements appeared in the Boston papers, praising the union of two distinguished families. Alexander's mother spoke enthusiastically about grandchildren and social prominence. His father discussed business opportunities that the marriage would create. Everyone seemed delighted except the groom himself, who felt increasingly like a man being prepared for execution rather than matrimony. Every arrangement tightened the golden chains that bound him to convention. 3 paths lay before Alexander Thornton, each more treacherous than the last. He could honor his engagement, marry Margaret, and spend his life wondering what might have been. He could break his betrothal, creating scandal that would destroy multiple families and likely drive Charles away forever. Or he could pursue both relationships, living a double life that would corrupt everything it touched. Standing in his conservatory among the orchids that had become symbols of his secret desires, Alexander faced the choice that would define the rest of his existence. Hidden in a false bottom drawer of his mahogany desk, Alexander's collection of Charles's letters grew thicker each week. Each one was potential evidence of his destruction, yet he couldn't bring himself to burn them. They represented the only honest emotions in his carefully orchestrated life. Late at night he would read them again, tracing Charles's handwriting with his finger, memorizing phrases that made his heart race. These letters were more dangerous than dynamite, and infinitely more precious than the engagement ring that felt like a weight around his future. What choice would he make? The answer came not through reasoned deliberation, but through the heart's quiet rebellion against duty. Alexander penned his most daring letter yet. My dear Charles, the conservatory awaits your visit. Come tomorrow evening after 10, when the household has retired. There are specimens I must show you that cannot be properly described in correspondence. His hand trembled as he sealed the envelope. He was crossing a line from which there could be no return. Choosing love over obligation, truth over safety, Charles over everyone else. By autumn of 1881, their correspondence had transformed from cautious pleasantries to barely concealed passion. Alexander's hand trembled as he wrote by candlelight in his Beacon Hill study. The rare orchid you mentioned has taken root in my conservatory, he penned to Charles. I find myself tending it with unusual devotion, watching for each new bloom. The metaphor fooled no one who might truly understand its meaning. Yet Alexander continued writing. his wedding ring catching the flame's light as he paused between dangerous words. Charles understood immediately. In the coded language of Victorian botanicals, orchids represented luxury, strength, and love. But between two men in 1881 Boston, they meant something far more dangerous. He kept Alexander's letters in a mahogany box beneath loose floorboards in his modest Marlborough Street apartment. Each missive grew more intimate than the last. "Your orchid speaks to me in the evening hours," Charles replied, "when proper society sleeps and honest hearts may finally breathe." But Alexander was already engaged to be married. The engagement announcement appeared in the Boston Globe on October 15, 1881. Mr. Alexander Whitmore of Beacon Hill, to wed Miss Catherine Lowell of Commonwealth Avenue this spring. Society columns praised the union of two prominent families. Yet that very evening, Alexander sent Charles the most passionate letter yet. "My heart belongs where it cannot dwell," he wrote. "What cruel fate binds us to lives we never chose?" The wedding was 6 months away. 6 months to decide between duty and desire. They developed an intricate code of communication that November. A violet tucked into Alexander's lapel meant he could meet that evening. Charles would respond by wearing his late father's gold pocket watch chain, the one reserved for special occasions. If Alexander carried his silver-headed walking stick, danger lurked, someone suspected. A blue silk handkerchief in Charles's breast pocket signaled the same warning. Their love became a language of objects, each accessory carrying weight beyond its appearance. Victorian society prized such attention to detail, never suspecting its subversive purpose. In his modest bachelor quarters, Charles fastened the gold chain to his waistcoat with trembling fingers. The watch had belonged to his father, a respected banker who died believing his son would follow conventional paths. Now it served as beacon for forbidden love. Charles studied his reflection in the small looking-glass above his washstand. The chain caught the gaslight, sending tiny golden signals across the room. Tonight, Alexander would see it and know. Tonight, they would risk everything for stolen moments together. But where could two men meet in 1881 Boston without arousing suspicion? Public spaces meant constant surveillance. Private clubs required explanations. Alexander's family estate offered one sanctuary, an abandoned carriage house beyond the main grounds, forgotten since his grandfather's time. Overgrown with ivy and hidden by ancient oak trees, it became their secret refuge. The building stood empty, except for old hay bales, discarded harnesses, and dust-covered windows that filtered afternoon light into golden streams. Here, for precious stolen hours, they could exist without pretense or fear. Inside the carriage house, time moved differently. Alexander would arrive first, hanging his formal coat on a wooden post like any ordinary man shedding the day's burdens. Charles brought books, volumes of poetry they could never discuss in proper society. Walt Whitman's forbidden verses, Tennyson's coded longings. Here, with dusty sunbeams streaming through broken shutters, Charles would read aloud while Alexander's head rested on his shoulder. For these moments, Boston's rigid social architecture crumbled around them. They were simply two souls finding solace in each other's presence. The intimacy they shared transcended physical desire. In a world that denied them basic human connection, these quiet afternoons represented revolutionary acts. Alexander traced passages in Charles's books with his finger, marking lines that spoke their truth. When I heard at the close of the day how my name had been received with plaudits in the capital, Charles read from Whitman. Still, it was not a happy night for me that followed. For the one I love most lay sleeping by me under the same cover in the cool night. Yet even paradise carries shadows. Each meeting brought them closer to discovery. Servants noticed Alexander's afternoon absences. His fiancée Catherine remarked on his distracted demeanor during social calls. Charles's landlady questioned his frequent trips to the countryside. The wedding approached like an inevitable storm, and with it, the end of everything they had built in secret. Alexander began arriving at their carriage house refuge with red-rimmed eyes, the weight of impossible choices etched across his aristocratic features. How long could their stolen sanctuary survive the crushing expectations of Gilded Age society? By February 1882, the strain showed in Alexander's letters. His elegant handwriting grew erratic, ink blots marking moments of hesitation. "I am drowning in expectations not my own," he wrote. "Each day brings me closer to a life that will kill everything true within me." Charles found these messages increasingly desperate, filled with references to death and duty that chilled him. The violet signals became less frequent. Some evenings, Alexander would appear at their meeting place only to pace frantically, unable to speak, his face a mask of torment. Miss Catherine Lowell was no naive debutante. Educated at finishing schools that taught young ladies to read social situations with surgical precision, she noticed her fiancé as growing distance. At dinner parties, Alexander's eyes would drift to windows facing the harbor, as if seeking escape routes. During their chaperoned walks through the common, he barely spoke. "You seem troubled, my dear," she observed one March afternoon. "Perhaps marriage will settle your restless spirit." But Catherine's sharp eyes suggested she suspected the truth was far more complicated. Mrs. Pemberton had rented rooms to bachelors for 30 years. She prided herself on maintaining a respectable establishment on Marlborough Street, carefully screening tenants for moral character. But Charles's behavior puzzled her. His frequent absences, the mysterious letters, the way he startled when she knocked on his door, all suggested secrets. "Mr. Morrison seems quite occupied with correspondence," she mentioned to her neighbor. "Young men today have such peculiar habits." Her suspicions grew with each violet Alexander left pressed between the pages of books Charles borrowed from the local library. April 20th, 1882. The date loomed like a death sentence in both men's minds. Wedding preparations consumed the Whitmore household. Caterers consulted, flowers ordered, invitations addressed in perfect copperplate. Alexander's mother directed the chaos with military precision, never noticing her son's hollow-eyed desperation. 3 weeks remained. 3 weeks to find courage for an impossible choice: abandon everything for love, or sacrifice love for everything. The carriage house meetings grew frantic, filled with whispered plans that dissolved into desperate embraces and bitter tears. Charles proposed escape. They could disappear to California, or better yet, Paris, where Oscar Wilde's circle lived more openly. Alexander could claim business interests required his presence abroad. They would be poor but free, anonymous but honest. "We could write to each other using our real names," Charles whispered during one April afternoon in their sanctuary. No more codes, no more violets. But Alexander's inheritance was tied to marriage, his family's expectations ironclad. Freedom would mean poverty, exile, and the destruction of everything his ancestors had built. The Whitmore name carried weight in Boston society stretching back to colonial times. Alexander's great-grandfather had signed the Constitution. His grandfather built the family's shipping fortune. His father served in the Massachusetts legislature. Each generation added to a legacy that demanded continuation through proper marriage and legitimate heirs. To abandon this inheritance for love seemed not just personal betrayal, but historical sacrilege. "I am not just myself," Alexander told Charles, with tears streaming down his face. "I am the vessel for centuries of expectation." Charles came from different circumstances. His father's banking position provided respectability but not dynasty. He could disappear more easily, reinvent himself in distant cities without destroying centuries of family honor. But loving Alexander meant accepting the full weight of his beloved's impossible position. "I would not ask you to destroy your heritage for me," Charles wrote in his final letter before the wedding, "but neither can I watch you destroy yourself for it." The choice, ultimately, belonged to Alexander alone, and time was running out. April 13th, 1882. 7 days until Alexander Whitmore would walk down the aisle of Trinity Church and pledge his life to Catherine Lowell. The final dress fittings were complete, the church flowers ordered, white roses and baby's breath, symbols of purity and eternal love. But in the abandoned carriage house, two men held each other as if the world was ending. Because for them, it was. Alexander had made his choice, though he couldn't yet bring himself to speak it aloud. Charles already knew. The violet signals had stopped completely. They met one final time on April 18th, 2 days before the wedding. No signals were needed. Both knew this would be their farewell. Alexander arrived at the carriage house carrying a small wrapped package. Inside, Charles found a gold locket containing a pressed violet and a photograph of Alexander taken in their early days of correspondence. "So you remember," Alexander whispered, "that once someone loved you completely." Charles had nothing material to offer in return, only words. "I will carry you with me wherever I go, even if we can never meet again in this life." On April 20th, 1882, Alexander Whitmore married Catherine Lowell in a ceremony the Boston Globe called the social event of the season. 300 guests filled Trinity Church. The bride wore imported French lace, the groom a perfectly tailored morning coat. Society photographers captured every detail for posterity, but no camera recorded the hollow look in Alexander's eyes, or the way his hands shook as he spoke his vows. History remembers the wedding. It forgot the love that died that day, sacrificed on the altar of social expectation and family honor. Among the scattered outbuildings of Alexander's family estate stood an abandoned carriage house, its windows boarded, its purpose forgotten. Here, beneath rotting timbers and behind warped doors, they discovered something neither had dared hope for, a place where they could simply exist. No watchful eyes, no careful words, no measured distances between their bodies. In this forgotten corner of the Whitmore grounds, Charles Hartwell and Alexander could finally breathe. The afternoon sun carved golden shafts through broken shutters, illuminating dust motes that danced like secrets in the air. Alexander's formal morning coat hung abandoned on a wooden post, its careful tailoring a discarded mask. They sat close on a hay bale, Charles's voice filling the silence as he read from Whitman's Leaves of Grass. Alexander's dark head rested against his shoulder, eyes closed, finally allowing himself this dangerous luxury of touch. In these stolen hours, their carefully constructed facades crumbled like autumn leaves. Charles's hand found Alexander's, their fingers intertwining with a familiarity that spoke of countless such moments. They spoke in whispers of futures they could never claim. A cottage by the sea, mornings without fear, evenings without performance. Here, in this crumbling sanctuary, they allowed themselves to imagine a world where love need not hide in shadows. "I love you," Alexander whispered, the words falling like stones into still water. 3 syllables that could destroy everything: their families, reputations, their social standing, their very lives. Charles's response was a kiss, soft and desperate, tasting of secrets and sorrow. They both knew the weight of what they shared, the impossibility of it. Yet in this moment, surrounded by dust and decay, they chose truth over safety. They met here through the turning seasons, spring rain drumming on the roof above them, summer heat making their shirts cling to damp skin, autumn leaves carpeting their secret threshold. Each visit was both blessing and risk. Each kiss a small rebellion against a world determined to keep them apart. They spoke of running away, of California's gold fields or Europe's more permissive cities, but always returned to the same impossible truth. Charles wrote constantly, on scraps of paper, in the margins of books, on the back of business correspondence, love letters that could never be sent, poems that would never see publication, declarations that existed only in the safety of their hidden sanctuary. He kept these fragments in a leather portfolio, tied with a ribbon Alexander had given him. Physical proof of an emotion society deemed criminal, evidence of a love that dared not speak its name. But even paradise casts shadows. They had grown too comfortable, perhaps, too trusting in their secret world. The estate servants noticed Alexander's increasingly frequent walks toward the abandoned outbuildings. His mother remarked on his improved spirits, his distracted air at dinner. Charles found himself humming melodies he couldn't name, his work suffering from pleasant distraction. Love, they discovered, was impossible to hide completely. It leaked through their careful performances like light through shutters. It was a Tuesday in November when Charles made his fatal mistake. Rushing to meet Alexander after a difficult morning at the bank, he took the main path through the house rather than his usual circuitous route. The letter, one of his most passionate declarations, slipped from his coat pocket somewhere between the grand foyer and the servants' quarters. By the time he realized his error and returned to search, it was too late. Young Timothy Walsh, barely 16 and desperate to prove his worth as a stable boy, found the cream envelope near the servants' stair. Unable to read more than his own name, he recognized quality paper when he saw it. Such fine stationery didn't belong below stairs. With the earnest efficiency of youth seeking approval, he carried his discovery directly to the butler's pantry. Mr. Hawthorne's weathered hands trembled as he read the first few lines. "My dearest Alexander," the letter began, "the hours between our meetings stretch like years." Hawthorne's face drained of color as he continued reading. 40 years of faithful service to the Whitmore family had not prepared him for this moment. The words on the cream paper burned themselves into his memory. Tender endearments, passionate declarations, references to stolen kisses and desperate embraces. His duty was clear, even as his heart rebelled against it. The brass bell in the butler's pantry chimed with unusual urgency. Within minutes, a footman appeared at Charles Hartwell's banking office with a message written on heavy Whitmore stationery. "Your immediate presence is required. Most urgent. E. Whitmore." Charles's blood turned to ice water. In 3 years of friendship with Alexander, he had never received direct communication from the elder Whitmore. The formal phrasing, the imperious tone, he knew somehow that their world was about to end. Edmund Whitmore stood like a monument to righteous indignation in his mahogany-paneled study. At 62, he had built his fortune through railroad investments and ruthless business acumen. His steel-gray hair was perfectly groomed, his black suit immaculate, his fury barely contained beneath a veneer of patrician control. The letter lay spread across his massive desk like evidence at a criminal trial. When Charles entered, those pale eyes fixed on him with the cold precision of a judge pronouncing sentence. Mr. Hartwell. The name dropped from Edmund's lips like a curse. Charles stood frozen in the doorway, hat clutched in white knuckles, knowing that denial was impossible. The evidence lay before them both, his own handwriting condemning him with every passionate word. I trust you recognize your own correspondence? The question hung in the air between them, sharp as a blade. Charles could only nod, his voice trapped somewhere deep in his chest, his carefully constructed life crumbling with each passing second. In 25 years of marriage, 30 years of business, 40 years of life in this city, I have never encountered such depravity. Edmund's voice remained level, controlled, more terrifying for its calm than any shouting could have been. You have corrupted my son, perverted him, led him into practices that would make Sodom blush. Each word fell like a physical blow. Charles felt his knees weaken, his vision blur at the edges. This was worse than discovery. This was Judgment Day. You understand, of course, that what you have described in this filth constitutes criminal behavior under the laws of New York State. Edmund lifted the letter with 2 fingers as if it might contaminate him through contact. Sodomy is punishable by imprisonment, Mr. Hartwell. Your bank, your family, your future, all forfeit. Unless, of course, we can reach an understanding. The threat hung between them, crystal clear in its implications. Charles's entire world, balanced on the edge of a precipice. You will leave New York within the week. Chicago, I'm told, suits men of your inclinations. You will resign your position, cite family obligations in the West. You will never contact my son again. No letters, no messages, no intermediaries. You will become, for all practical purposes, dead to him. Edmund's terms were delivered with the precision of a business contract. Charles wanted to protest, to fight, to demand the right to see Alexander one final time. Instead, he heard his own voice, hollow and defeated, whisper a single word. Yes. Where is Alexander? Charles finally found the courage to ask. Edmund's smile was sharp as winter wind. My son is confined to his rooms, considering his future. He will marry Miss Elizabeth Thornton before Christmas, a union that will restore propriety to this family's name. As for his recent confusion, we shall never speak of it again. The finality in his voice was absolute. Alexander was already lost, already transformed back into the dutiful son society demanded him to be. As Charles walked the familiar path to the abandoned carriage house one final time, autumn leaves crunched beneath his feet like broken promises. The golden sanctuary that had sheltered their love stood empty, already feeling like a tomb. He left no note, no final message. What words could capture the death of a dream? By sunset, he would be on a westbound train, carrying nothing but memories of stolen afternoons and a love that society had deemed too dangerous to exist. The locomotive's whistle shrieked through the November night as Charles boarded the westbound express. In his coat pocket, he carried one final letter, not to Alexander, but about him, addressed to no one, signed by no name. Some loves, he had written in his careful script, burn too bright for this world to contain them. We tried to build paradise in the shadows, but shadows, I have learned, belong to those who cast them. The train pulled away from everything he had ever known, carrying him toward an uncertain exile. February 14th, 1889. Valentine's Day brought no romance to the Whitmore mansion, only reckoning. Alexander's father had discovered everything. The coded letters, the midnight meetings, the whispered promises between his son and Charles Hartwell. The patriarch's voice cut through the mahogany-paneled study like winter wind. 24 hours to choose: marriage to Miss Eleanor Blackwood or complete disinheritance. Charles would face public ruin, his medical practice destroyed through carefully orchestrated whispers. Love or legacy? The fireplace crackled, indifferent to hearts breaking. How had Alexander's father learned their secret? The answer lay scattered across the mahogany desk: intercepted letters, decoded by a private investigator hired to follow his son's questionable associations. Each tender word between Alexander and Charles had been catalogued, analyzed, transformed into weapons. My dearest orchid, now evidence of moral corruption. Until the stars ceased their dance. Proof of unnatural affection. Their private language of devotion had become a prosecutor's toolkit. Trust had been the first casualty of this war between love and propriety. A marriage certificate lay ready on the desk, needing only Alexander's signature. Eleanor Blackwood, 23, refined, entirely unaware she was being offered as salvation. Her father's railroad fortune would merge perfectly with Whitmore's shipping interests. Society would smile approvingly at the match. But what of the woman herself, destined to share a bed with a man whose heart belonged elsewhere? Alexander stared at the document, understanding that his signature would doom 3 lives to elaborate deception. Sometimes love's greatest cruelty was its honesty. At his modest brownstone apartment, Charles Hartwell received his own ultimatum via private messenger. The note bore no signature, but its meaning was unmistakable: leave New York immediately or face professional destruction. Medical licenses could be revoked through careful pressure on the right officials. Hospital privileges could vanish overnight. Patients would find other physicians when whispers reached the right ears. Charles understood the unspoken mathematics of power. A shipping fortune trumped a young doctor's reputation every time. His hands trembled as he read the deadline: departure within 48 hours. Alexander chose compromise over capitulation. If his father demanded marriage, he would marry, but Charles would not face ruin. Working through intermediaries, Alexander arranged passage on the Central Pacific Railroad to San Francisco, along with letters of introduction to California physicians who might value skill over scandal. A trust fund, carefully hidden from his father's oversight, would provide Charles modest independence. It was protection, not abandonment. At least, that's what Alexander told himself as he signed documents that would send his heart 3,000 miles westward. They met one final time in Central Park, near the reservoir where they had shared so many stolen afternoons. February snow muffled their footsteps as Alexander explained his impossible choice. Charles listened in silence, understanding that love sometimes demanded the ultimate sacrifice: letting go. They exchanged no dramatic vows, made no promises to wait. Instead, Charles pressed a small photograph into Alexander's gloved hand, himself in medical attire, eyes bright with dreams that New York would not let him realize. "Remember me as I was," he whispered, "not as I must become." March 2nd, 1889. Grace Church overflowed with New York's finest families, all gathered to witness the union of shipping and railroad fortunes. Alexander stood at the altar, in perfect morning dress, every inch the prosperous gentleman. Eleanor arrived in French silk and family pearls, radiant in her ignorance of the tragedy she was entering. The ceremony proceeded flawlessly, vows spoken, rings exchanged, society's approval sealed with champagne toasts. Only Alexander's hollow eyes betrayed the truth. That morning he had buried his heart alive to preserve his name. As wedding bells chimed across Manhattan, Charles Hartwell climbed aboard the westbound Central Pacific at Grand Central Depot. His possessions fit in a single leather valise, medical instruments, diplomas, and one daguerreotype of Alexander taken during happier days. Fellow passengers chatted excitedly about California's opportunities, but Charles stared silently through the window as New York's spires faded into memory. He carried no bitterness, only the weight of understanding that some loves were too dangerous for this world. The train's whistle seemed to echo his heart's final goodbye. From Sacramento, Charles sent one last letter, postmarked simply, "A friend in California." The message was brief, coded in their private language. "My orchid must find new soil to flourish in. The hothouse was too dangerous for such delicate blooms. Remember that transplanted flowers sometimes grow stronger in foreign ground. Do not mourn the garden we could not tend together." Alexander kept this letter in his desk's secret compartment for 37 years, the paper worn soft from countless readings. It was all that remained of their impossible spring. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore was no fool. Within months of marriage, she recognized the careful distance her husband maintained, the way his eyes grew vacant during social gatherings, his habit of staring westward from their drawing-room windows. She discovered the locked desk drawer, the hidden compartment, though she never dared examine its contents. At dinner parties, she played the contented wife while privately wondering what ghost haunted their marriage bed. Some secrets were too dangerous to confront, even when they slowly poisoned everything they touched. To external observers, Alexander Whitmore thrived. His shipping business expanded across 3 ports. He served on hospital boards and cultural committees. Society columns praised his civic contributions and his wife's charitable works. At 45, he commanded respect in financial circles and dinner invitations to the finest homes. Success, however, proved hollow comfort for a man who had traded his authentic self for social acceptance. Each public triumph felt like another brick in the wall that separated him from the life he truly wanted. Occasionally, news filtered back through mutual acquaintances. Dr. Charles Hartwell had established a successful practice in San Francisco's growing medical community. He specialized in treating industrial accidents, his gentle manner bringing comfort to injured dock workers and factory laborers. He never married, dedicating himself entirely to healing others' wounds while his own remained carefully hidden. Alexander learned these details through careful, indirect inquiries, each small revelation both treasure and torment. Charles was surviving, perhaps even flourishing, but always alone. Decades accumulated like sediment, burying their love deeper beneath layers of routine and resignation. Alexander's hair turned silver, his face lined by years of careful smiles that never reached his eyes. He fathered 2 children with Eleanor, dutiful heirs who would inherit his shipping empire, but never know the father who might have existed in a kinder world. At family gatherings, he played his role perfectly: devoted husband, proud father, pillar of community. Only in private moments did he allow himself to remember what sacrifice had cost. Eleanor Whitmore died in 1923, taking her husband's secrets to the grave. In her final days, she spoke of their marriage with careful neutrality, grateful for his kindness, proud of their children, diplomatic about deeper matters. She had lived 34 years beside a ghost, loving a man who could never fully return her affection. Perhaps she understood that Alexander had sacrificed his happiness not just for social position, but to protect someone else from ruin. Her silence was its own form of love, complicated, selfless, and ultimately tragic. Widowed at 69, Alexander Whitmore became even more reclusive. His children managed the shipping business while he retreated to his study, surrounded by books he no longer read and memories he couldn't escape. Servants noticed his habit of writing letters he never sent, addressing them to "my dear friend in California," before burning them in the fireplace. He died in 1926, 3 days after receiving news that Dr. Charles Hartwell had passed away in San Francisco. Some hearts, it seemed, were synchronized, even across continents and decades. Alexander's estate executors discovered the secret compartment 3 days after his funeral. Inside lay Charles's letters, the daguerreotype, pressed orchids, and a journal documenting their relationship in careful code. Also found 47 unmailed letters to California, each beginning "My dear orchid" and ending "Until the stars cease their dance." The executors, understanding the explosive nature of these documents, quietly burned them in the mansion's main fireplace. They believed they were protecting the family reputation, but they were actually erasing love itself from the historical record. In San Francisco, Dr. Charles Hartwell had kept his own archive of memories. His medical colleagues found them after his death. Newspaper clippings of Alexander's business successes, wedding announcements, obituary notices of mutual New York acquaintances. A single daguerreotype of Alexander sat on his bedside table for 37 years, the only decoration in an otherwise Spartan bedroom. Charles had built a successful life in California, but he had never stopped loving the man who had chosen duty over devotion. His final diary entry read simply, "The orchid remembers its first garden." Official records remember Alexander Whitmore as a successful businessman and civic leader. Charles Hartwell appears in medical directories as a respected physician who served San Francisco's working class. Neither man's obituary mentioned the love that had shaped their lives and choices. Their sacrifice, trading authentic happiness for social survival, remained invisible to history. Yet in quiet moments, scattered across decades, they had continued loving each other through memory and regret. Their story survived not in documents or photographs, but in the empty spaces where their hearts used to be. Did Alexander Whitmore make the right choice in 1889? Could love have survived the scandal that would have destroyed both men's lives? We'll never know if Charles truly found peace in California's anonymity, or if Alexander's children suspected their father's carefully guarded secret. What remains certain is this: two men loved each other in an age that criminalized such affection, and they paid the price in different currencies, one through conformity, the other through exile. Their story asks us what we might have chosen, faced with impossible odds and unforgiving times. By October 1888, Alexander Whitmore's resistance had crumbled. His father's ultimatum was clear: marry Catherine Aldrich by Christmas or forfeit the family fortune entirely. But here's what the wedding announcements didn't reveal. Alexander had already made his own secret arrangements. 3 days before his engagement was announced in the New York Herald, he purchased a first-class railway ticket to San Francisco. The name on that ticket? Charles Montgomery. Was this Alexander's final gift to the man he could never legally claim? Hidden beneath floorboards in the carriage house, investigators found Alexander's draft of his final letter to Charles. The handwriting is shaky, blotted with what appear to be tears. "My dearest orchid," it begins, "the garden here grows too cold for delicate blooms. You must find new soil to flourish in, far from these harsh winters." He enclosed $500, a fortune in 1888, and detailed instructions for establishing a law practice in California. What did Charles think when he received this devastating act of love disguised as abandonment? December 15, 1888. Trinity Church in New York overflowed with Manhattan's elite for Alexander Whitmore's wedding to Catherine Aldrich. Society pages called it the union of the season, but examine the wedding photograph closely. Alexander stands rigid beside his bride, his eyes fixed not on Catherine's face, but somewhere beyond the camera, beyond the church walls. His boutonniere? A single white orchid. Even his wedding guests couldn't have imagined the true meaning behind that floral choice, could they? On that same December morning, 3,000 miles away, Charles Montgomery boarded the Continental Express in Chicago. His westward journey had begun weeks earlier, a slow, agonizing progression away from everything he'd ever known. Witnesses at the station described a well-dressed young man carrying only a single leather suitcase, notable for his refusal to look back as the train pulled away. Inside that suitcase, Alexander's letters, a pressed violet, and the foundations of an entirely new life. Did he know he would never return east again? What began in December 1889 would continue for 32 years. The annual Christmas correspondence between two men who could never again speak freely. Each card bore only initials, AW to CM, CM to AW, but hidden within seemingly innocent holiday greetings were layers of coded meaning. "The winter garden sleeps peacefully," Alexander wrote in 1891. Charles replied, "California orchids bloom year-round." Were these simple, seasonal observations, or something far more profound? The evidence suggests these men developed an entire secret language of longing. The Whitmore household appeared prosperous and proper. Alexander and Catherine produced 3 children between 1890 and 1895, Margaret, Thomas, and little Catherine Jr. But servants, accounts, discovered in estate records, tell a different story. Alexander maintained a separate bedroom from 1892 onward. He spent hours staring westward from his study window. Cook noted he never ate the elaborate dinners Catherine planned, preferring solitary meals of bread and orchid tea. What kind of man drinks orchid tea every evening for 20 years? Charles Montgomery established his San Francisco law practice in 1889, specializing in estate planning for the city's growing merchant class. By 1895, he owned a 3-story townhouse on Nob Hill and employed 4 junior attorneys. Society pages regularly mentioned his attendance at cultural events, always alone. His housekeeper later recalled that he kept fresh violets in every room, regardless of season or expense. "Seemed peculiar for a bachelor," she noted. But was Charles truly building a new life, or merely constructing an elaborate prison of respectability? April 18, 1906. The San Francisco earthquake destroyed much of Charles's neighborhood, but his townhouse survived with minimal damage. In the chaos of rescue efforts, however, something extraordinary emerged. Neighbors helping to clear debris from his study discovered a wooden chest, fire-damaged but intact. Inside, every letter Alexander had ever written him, carefully preserved and organized by date. After 18 years of separation, Charles still treasured every word from his lost love. Why risk saving these incriminating documents through a natural disaster? Catherine Whitmore died suddenly in March 1912, officially of pneumonia. But Dr. Harrison's private notes, found in his medical files 50 years later, raised disturbing questions. Catherine had been in perfect health just days before her illness. She'd recently discovered something in Alexander's study that, quote, caused her great distress. The doctor noted unusual marks on her throat, but attributed them to coughing fits. Alexander showed no grief at her funeral, only what witnesses described as, quote, barely contained anticipation. What had Catherine discovered, and why did her death seem to liberate rather than devastate her husband? June 15, 1912. For the first time in 24 years, Alexander Whitmore wrote Charles Montgomery a letter using their real names. "My dearest Charles," it began, "the cage door has finally opened. I am free to love whom I choose, to live as I was meant to live. Will you meet me where we first discovered each other?" The letter took 18 days to reach San Francisco. Charles's reply was immediate and equally direct. "I have waited every day for 24 years. Yes." But what forces had they underestimated after such a long separation? Alexander spent weeks preparing for Charles's return. He had the old carriage house cleaned and furnished with Persian rugs and comfortable chairs. The gardener was instructed to plant orchids throughout the property, despite their unsuitability for the northeastern climate. Alexander commissioned new photographs of himself to send ahead, wanting Charles to see how the years had changed him. Most tellingly, he legally transferred half his fortune to Charles Montgomery on July 30th, 1912, 2 weeks before their planned reunion. Was this generosity, or did Alexander somehow know he was running out of time? Charles departed San Francisco on August 10th, 1912, aboard the California Limited. Unlike his desperate westward flight 24 years earlier, this journey brimmed with anticipation. He traveled first class, occupying a private compartment filled with gifts for Alexander California wine, pressed flowers from his garden, and a leather-bound journal chronicling every year of their separation. Fellow passengers noted his nervous excitement, his constant checking of his pocket watch. The train was scheduled to arrive in New York on August 15th. Charles Montgomery was finally coming home. What could possibly go wrong after all this careful planning? August 13, 1912. Charles's train had reached Chicago when the conductor delivered a telegram to his compartment. The message was brief. "Charles Montgomery, stop. Regret to inform, stop. Alexander Whitmore died August 12th. Stop. Heart failure. Stop. Funeral August 16th. Stop. Deepest condolences. Stop. Whitmore Estate." Witnesses described Charles collapsing as he read it, the telegram fluttering to the floor. After 24 years of separation, they had missed their reunion by just 3 days. But was Alexander's death really from natural causes, or had someone discovered their plans? Dr. Harrison's examination of Alexander found no obvious cause for the heart failure. Alexander was 53, in good health, and had shown no previous cardiac symptoms. More puzzling still, he was discovered in the carriage house at dawn on August 12th. Fully dressed in his finest clothes as if expecting a visitor. The scene was set for a romantic reunion. Wine, orchids, and 2 chairs positioned intimately close. Yet the medical report noted traces of digitalis in his system, a heart medication Alexander had never been prescribed. Who else knew about the planned reunion, and why would they want to prevent it? Alexander's eldest son Thomas inherited the estate, but with it came a disturbing discovery. Hidden in his father's desk was correspondence with Charles Montgomery dating back decades, along with the recent legal documents transferring half the fortune to this mysterious California lawyer. Thomas immediately contacted his attorneys to block the inheritance transfer. More ominously, they found evidence that Thomas had been monitoring his father's correspondence for months. Had the dutiful son learned of his father's plans for reunion? And had he taken steps to protect the family name from scandal? Rather than return to California, Charles remained in New York for Alexander's funeral. He stood at the back of Trinity Church, unrecognized by the family, watching as they buried the only man he'd ever loved. Later that evening, cemetery workers reported seeing a solitary figure placing orchids on the fresh grave. But Charles wasn't finished with his vigil. For the next 3 weeks, he walked daily through the Whitmore estate, eventually finding his way to the carriage house where they'd planned to reunite. What did he hope to find in that space of shattered dreams? September 1st, 1912. Charles made his final pilgrimage to the carriage house, now stripped of all the romantic preparations Alexander had made. The orchids had already wilted in the harsh northeastern climate. Exotic blooms never meant to survive in that soil. Charles placed a single violet on the old hay bale where they'd first kissed 25 years earlier. A groundskeeper later found him there at sunset, sitting alone in the gathering darkness, speaking quietly to the empty air. "I came back," were the only words the man could make out. "I came back, just as I promised." Charles Montgomery departed New York on September 3, 1912, carrying with him the legal documents that would have made him wealthy beyond imagination. Documents now worthless, thanks to Thomas Whitmore's legal challenges. But he also carried something more precious: the final letter Alexander had written, found pinned to the carriage house door. "If you are reading this, then I have failed to wait long enough for you. Forgive me, my orchid. Build a garden in California beautiful enough for both of us." Would Charles find the strength to honor Alexander's final wish, or would grief consume what remained of his life? Back in San Francisco, Charles Montgomery transformed his Nob Hill property into something extraordinary. Using his own fortune, he created the most elaborate private orchid conservatory on the West Coast. Hundreds of exotic species, thriving in specially designed glass houses. Neighbors reported that he spent every evening among the flowers, talking softly to the blooms as if they could hear him. When visitors asked about the unusual garden, Charles would simply say, "I'm keeping a promise to an old friend." But was this beautiful sanctuary a memorial to lost love, or something far more haunting? Charles Montgomery died peacefully in his conservatory on March 15, 1925, exactly 13 years after Catherine Whitmore's suspicious death. His will contained a startling provision. The entire orchid collection was to be shipped east and planted on Alexander Whitmore's grave, so that beauty might finally bloom where love once died. But when groundskeepers began preparing the shipment, they made a disturbing discovery beneath the conservatory's foundation: human remains, carefully buried with loving precision. DNA testing wouldn't exist for decades, but one detail was unmistakable: a violet pressed between the skeleton's ribs, exactly where a heart would beat. Had Charles found a way to bring Alexander home after all? September 1912. Alexander Whitmore sits at his mahogany desk, his silver hair catching the amber gaslight. His wife has been dead 3 months. The chains that bound him for 37 years have finally snapped. His pen trembles as he writes to Charles, "We are free men now, free to meet as we always dreamed." But can 3 decades of silence be bridged with ink and paper? Can love survive the weight of years spent in shadow? Charles's reply comes within the week, his handwriting shakier now but unmistakably his own. "Yes, my dearest friend, the carriage house where it all began. Let us return there as ourselves at last." Alexander reads the letter 3 times, memorizing every word. After nearly 4 decades of coded messages and hidden meanings, they will finally speak their truth aloud. But why does Charles's handwriting seem so unsteady? October 15, 1912. Alexander walks the familiar path to the carriage house, his cane tapping against cobblestones, slick with autumn rain. The estate grounds have grown wild. Ivy chokes the garden walls, and weeds push through the gravel drive. He moves slowly, savoring each step toward a reunion 37 years in the making. Will Charles recognize the old man he's become? Will love still live in eyes grown dim with age? The carriage house stands weathered and hollow, its paint peeling like old skin. Dust motes dance in shafts of afternoon light streaming through cracked windows. Alexander steps inside, breathing the scent of old hay and forgotten dreams. The same wooden beam where Charles once carved their initials, AW and CM forever, bears the scars of time. But where is Charles? Why does silence answer Alexander's whispered greeting? Alexander removes a single violet from his coat pocket, the same flower Charles once pressed between pages of Whitman's poetry. He places it gently on the old hay bale where they shared their first kiss in 1875. The purple petals look fragile against the weathered wood, a small act of faith in a reunion that feels increasingly uncertain. Minutes stretch into hours. Still, Charles does not come. The sun sinks lower, painting the carriage house walls amber and gold. Alexander remains, his faith wavering but unbroken. Perhaps Charles's train was delayed. Perhaps age has slowed his steps, as it has slowed Alexander's own. He adjusts his pocket watch. 6 o'clock. 7. 8. The violet begins to wilt. Still he waits, unwilling to abandon hope after carrying it for so many decades. Darkness claims the estate as Alexander finally abandons his vigil. Each step away from the carriage house feels like a small death. His cane strikes the cobblestones in a lonely rhythm, echoing off the ivy-covered walls. Something has gone terribly wrong, but what? Charles's letter promised he would come. Where is the man who waited 37 years for this single moment of freedom? 3 days later, a package arrives at Alexander's door. Inside, all of his letters to Charles, carefully preserved, and one final note in an unfamiliar hand. Alexander's heart hammers as he unfolds the cream-colored paper. The words blur through his tears. Mr. Whitmore, I regret to inform you that my brother Charles passed from pneumonia on October 12th, 3 days before your planned meeting. The letter continues in the brother's careful script. Charles spoke of you often in his final days. He asked me to tell you that the orchid bloomed beautifully, even in distant soil. He carried your photograph in his pocket for 37 years. Alexander's world collapses. While he waited in the carriage house, breathing hope into autumn air, Charles was already 3 days cold in his grave. Alexander sits motionless in his study as the gaslight flickers and dies. The final letter falls from his nerveless fingers to the Persian rug below. 37 years of waiting ended not in reunion but in devastating solitude. The man he loved more than breath itself died clutching Alexander's photograph, while Alexander placed a violet on an empty hay bale and waited for a ghost. But Alexander does not surrender to despair. Instead, he rises with grim purpose and retrieves every letter Charles ever wrote him. Each word becomes sacred now, each pressed flower a relic of impossible love. He opens the secret compartment in his desk, the same hiding place where their correspondence was discovered a century later, and begins his final act of preservation. One by one, Alexander files away the evidence of their hidden love. Charles's poetry, pressed violets, sketches of architectural details that served as coded messages, daguerreotypes taken in secret. Each artifact tells the story of two men who loved fiercely, despite a world that demanded their silence. He will not let their story die with them. Someone, someday, must know. Alexander opens his diary and writes his final entry. Charles is gone, and I remain. Our love was born in shadows and died in silence, but it was real. More real than any socially sanctioned marriage, truer than any acceptable affection. Let these letters speak when we no longer can. Let someone remember that we existed, that we loved, that we mattered. Alexander seals the compartment and takes the secret to his grave in 1915. For 107 years, the letters sleep in darkness, waiting. Dust settles on the desk. The mansion changes hands. Wars rage and end. Society slowly, grudgingly evolves. But love, real love, remains unchanged, patient as stone, waiting for someone to discover its truth. 2019. Museum conservators preparing the Whitmore estate for public tours discover the hidden drawer purely by accident. Inside, 437 letters spanning 43 years, each one a small act of rebellion against a world that demanded love hide its face. The paper is brittle, the ink faded, but the words burn as bright as the day they were written. Each letter reveals another layer of the elaborate life Alexander and Charles constructed around their impossible love. Coded references to architectural features that meant "I love you." Business correspondence that hid poetry in its margins. Dinner invitations that were actually love songs. They created an entire language of longing that outlived the silence imposed upon them. The Whitmore Mansion opens as a museum in 2020. In the corner of the library where their love story began, a small brass plaque reads, "In memory of Alexander Whitmore and Charles Morrison, lives lived in shadow, loves held in secret, voices finally heard." Their correspondence is displayed in climate-controlled cases, no longer hidden but celebrated. Sunlight streams through the same library windows, where Alexander once stole glances at Charles across crowded dinner parties. The shadows that once concealed stolen moments now preserve their memory. Visitors pause before the display cases, reading letters that were never meant for public eyes, but speak universal truths about the human heart's capacity for hope. Alexander and Charles never held hands in public, never spoke their love aloud, never lived as the men they truly were. But they created something more powerful than visibility. They created permanence. Their secret language of flowers and coded letters speaks across a century of progress to remind us that love, in all its forms, has always found a way to survive. In the end, perhaps this is their greatest triumph. That two men who lived their entire lives in shadow cast enough light to illuminate the path for those who came after. Their love letters, preserved in darkness for over a century, finally rest in sunlight. Visible, honored, and eternally real. The orchid bloomed beautifully, even in distant soil.